linguistic analysis, ransom note, phraseology and attribution, deconstructing language, syntax, and the fingerprints of identity. A person's language is, in many ways, as individual as a fingerprint. The phrases we choose, the way we structure sentences, our relationship to formality and colloquialism, the words we misspell and the words we spell correctly. All of these are markers of identity. They reveal education level. They expose regional origin. They hint at what we've read, what media we've consumed, what influences have shaped the way we think and express thought. The ransom note found at the Ramsey home on the morning of December 26, 1996, is one of the longest ransom notes in the history of kidnapping cases. This length is significant. As forensic experts understand, the longer a document is, the harder it becomes to disguise one's handwriting or linguistic patterns. A note written hastily, under pressure, by someone desperate to communicate a message tends to revert to authentic patterns of speech and writing, the patterns that are most deeply ingrained. What we find when we examine the ransom note is a document that contains profound contradictions. It is simultaneously educated and colloquial. It is formal in structure and crude in threat. It uses carefully constructed phrases and misspelled words. It reveals someone who is trying to be articulate, while also someone who struggles with basic orthography. And woven throughout are phrases and references that have appeared in specific movies, songs, and cultural artifacts, details that point toward a specific person or a specific circle of influence. The question becomes, who could have written this note? The regional marker. Good Southern common sense. One of the first linguistic markers to arrest attention is a single phrase that appears in the ransom note. "You are not the only fat cat in this town, John," and "Use your good Southern common sense." The word Southern is the key detail. It appears in the note as "good Southern common sense," an instruction that would be peculiar coming from a stranger or an intruder. But it is extraordinarily revealing when we consider the family's geography. John Ramsey was from Michigan. He was not a Southerner. Patsy Ramsey, however, was from West Virginia. She had been a Southern belle in the pageant world. Her mother was Southern. Her entire family network, her pageant background, her social identity was rooted in the South. When the note writer uses Southern as a modifier, they are not randomly choosing words. They are invoking a regional identity. They are speaking to someone using a vocabulary that suggests understanding of regional difference. This is a detail that is much more naturally available to someone embedded in a Southern family dynamic than to a stranger. Investigators immediately noticed this anomaly. The note addresses John Ramsey directly, personalizing the message to him, yet it uses a regional marker that would not logically apply to him. This suggests either a significant misunderstanding of John's background, unlikely for someone who had done enough research to demand a specific ransom amount, or a writer who was naturally embedded in Southern language and culture and spoke it authentically. The phrase collection, fat cats, and grow a brain. In his deposition, John Ramsey identified several phrases in the ransom note that struck him as unusual. He noted, "Grow a brain, and you are not the only fat cat in this town, John." When investigators asked whether he had ever heard these phrases used in relation to him before, John stated, "No." But then came a critical follow-up. When asked whether anybody he knew used these phrases, John recalled something important. Priscilla White, his close friend Fleet White's wife, a woman who was often in the Ramsey home, who attended the Christmas party, who was deeply embedded in the family's social circle, had used the term fat cat in his presence. Let us consider what this means. One of the phrases in the ransom note, a phrase that investigators specifically highlighted as unusual, can be directly attributed to someone in John Ramsey's intimate social circle. This is not a phrase a stranger would naturally use. This is not language that an intruder would randomly pull from their vocabulary. And grow a brain. When investigators pressed on this, John recalled that Don Paw, Patsy's father, had used this phrase. According to John's recollection, Don had said, "grow a brain," to one of the media indigents at a mall, and this had been one of the recollections that came up during the family's discussions about the ransom note. So we have identified a pattern. Phrases that appear in the ransom note are directly traceable to people in the family's immediate circle. Not generic phrases, not language that could have been pulled from anywhere. Specific, identifiable phrases that had been used by specific people in the family's presence. The movie references, talking to the stray dog. Perhaps the most striking linguistic markers in the ransom note are movie references. The phrase "talking to the stray dog" appears in the note. Investigators determined that this phrase originates from the 1971 film Dirty Harry, starring Clint Eastwood. In his interviews, John Ramsey was asked directly about this. When confronted with the fact that "talking to the stray dog" appeared in Dirty Harry, he stated he had not known this until the investigator told him. When asked whether he had ever seen Dirty Harry, John's response was vague. He said it seems like he has seen it, but he was uncertain. He believed it was an old movie with Clint Eastwood, but he did not remember what it was about. If he had seen it, he said, it was well before. Notably, when pressed about whether he had seen it in a theater or rented it, John stated, "I don't remember seeing it. I just remember I know the name, and it's Clint Eastwood." This is an uncertain memory. This is not a definitive statement. And yet, the ransom note contains a specific phrase from this film, a phrase that would only be available to someone who had actually seen the movie or read about it in detail. The critical question becomes, who in the household had seen Dirty Harry? Who had it available? Who would have the kind of familiarity with this film that would lead to pulling specific phrases from it and inserting them into a ransom note? John claimed uncertainty, but others in the household, Patsy perhaps, or family members, might have had a clearer relationship to the film. This is where linguistic analysis becomes a map of access and knowledge. The ransom movie connection, another film reference beyond Dirty Harry, investigators discovered another connection. According to John's interview, some people told us if that it was, or if we read the newspaper or what. But apparently there's some very strange similarities to some of these phrases that appeared in the movie Ransom. John stated explicitly, "There was a movie called Ransom, which I never saw. There was similarities, we were told." He emphasized, "Some people told us if that it was, or if we read the newspaper or what. But apparently there's some very strange similarities to some of these phrases, none of which I don't believe we had seen or have seen." So the ransom note contains not one, but multiple movie references, linguistic markers that point toward specific films. John denies seeing these films, but the ransom note contains their language. This suggests that whoever wrote the note had a different media exposure than John, or a different familiarity with popular culture, or a different set of influences. The education level contradiction, articulate yet flawed. When we examine the ransom note as a whole, we encounter a document that is, in some ways, remarkably articulate. The note is lengthy. It contains complex sentence structures. It attempts to project authority and intelligence. The writer is trying to sound educated, trying to sound in control, trying to sound like someone who thinks in sophisticated ways. Yet there are misspellings. There are word choices that suggest someone who does not spell certain words correctly, or who does not have perfect command of English orthography. John noted this contradiction explicitly. When asked about the misspellings in the note, he observed that Patsy writes very neatly. she is a feminine writer, and that there are misspellings in the note. She graduated at the top of her class. She doesn't misspell words like business and possession. This is John defending his wife by noting that the misspellings in the note are inconsistent with her educational background and her demonstrated writing ability. But this defense also raises a question. If someone educated enough to graduate at the top of their class wrote this note while trying to disguise their handwriting and their identity, would they deliberately misspell words like business? Or would the misspellings be genuine, revealing the actual educational level and literacy of the writer? Investigators explored this directly. When asked whether misspellings might have been an attempt to disguise identity, John responded, "I don't think so, because I think they tried to be very articulate to the best of their ability, and misspellings were because they didn't know how to spell those words." John is suggesting that the misspellings are authentic, that they reveal the writer's actual level of literacy, rather than a deliberate attempt to disguise identity. This is a significant observation. It suggests that whoever wrote the note attempted to write above their actual educational level, producing a note that is more sophisticated in intent than in execution. Who in the household fits this profile? Someone who is educated, but not entirely confident in their spelling. Someone who aspires to sound more educated than they are. The handwriting question, inconsistency and analysis. The ransom note was written on paper, taken from the Ramsey home, with a pen found in the Ramsey home. The fact that the murder weapon, the writing implement, and the writing surface all originated within the house is significant. It suggests someone with access, someone familiar with the home's contents, someone who was not equipped for a formal kidnapping, but who used what was available. The handwriting analysis of the note has been disputed. Some experts believed the note could have been written by Patsy. Others were less certain. The fact that handwriting experts could not definitively eliminate Patsy, that she could not be absolutely eliminated, despite appearing highly improbable, is itself significant. John explained the findings as he understood them. "I was told that it was virtually certain that she did not write the note, but that there were some similarities which exist in all of our handwriting because we have all been taught the same, and that is how we communicate, is with the written language in English." But he also noted that there were more dissimilarities in her writing than a number of other people that had been looked at. What this means is that while Patsy was not the most likely suspect based on handwriting analysis, she was not entirely eliminated. And notably, others, people whose handwriting showed more similarity to the note, were also not definitively excluded. The handwriting question, then, becomes not a simple answer, but a pattern of partial similarities and notable differences that point toward someone in the household, someone whose writing was familiar enough to the investigators that they examined it, but sufficiently different from the note that it could not be conclusively ruled out. The syntax and structure. Patterns of thinking. Beyond individual words and phrases, the ransom note reveals something about how the writer thinks. The structure of the note is formal. Addresses, salutations, carefully constructed paragraphs. But it is also contradictory in its formality. It begins with Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, and then switches to addressing John personally as John. Patsy noticed this when she examined the note. She pointed out the shift in formality. This is not a random choice. This reflects a shift in the writer's relationship to the addressee. It begins as a formal kidnapping demand and transitions into something more personal, more direct, more intimate. This suggests a writer who is shifting between different registers of communication, between the formal and the personal, between the constructed persona and the authentic voice. The note also contains what some have identified as proofreader marks, editorial notation suggesting that the writer was revising as they wrote, crossing out words and adding insertions. This is not the mark of someone hastily scrawling a threat. This is someone who is composing, revising, trying to get the language just right. What does this tell us? That the writer was invested in the presentation, that they cared about how the note would be perceived, that they were not simply making a demand, but was crafting a narrative. The unusual politiness. Adequate attaché and the delivery will be exhausting. One of the most striking features of the ransom note is its unusual courtesy. The note is threatening, crude, violent in its language, yet it contains polite instructions. It tells John to bring an adequate size attaché. It states, "The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested." This is the language of someone trying to be considerate, even while making threats. It is solicitous. It is almost apologetic about the difficulty of the ransom delivery. Patsy herself noted this quality when she was asked about the note. She said, "Again, we have a pretty polite kidnapper, and the delivery will be exhausting. They are preparing somebody for all this. Again, unlike any other ransom note that I have ever seen." This is an observation that cuts to the heart of the note's strangeness. Most ransom notes are crude demands. This note is almost thoughtful in its consideration of the victim's father's comfort. It is written by someone who, even while making threats, retains a layer of civility. What does this suggest about the writer? Someone who is naturally polite? Someone from a background where consideration and courtesy are ingrained? Someone who perhaps feels conflict about what they are doing? The amount, 12 cents, shy of $118,000. One more linguistic detail deserves attention. The amount demanded is $118,000. This is an extraordinarily specific figure. Most kidnappers demand round numbers, $100,000 or $200,000. The specificity of $118,000 raises immediate questions. Both John and Patsy were struck by this amount. John noted it was a very odd amount. Patsy observed that it was an unusual amount of money, and that somebody that made reference to business. They would be knowledgeable that Access had just made $1 billion year. Something. I mean, why would you piddle around with $118,000? The amount is significant because it is so specific. Where does $118,000 come from? Is it connected to an insurance policy? To a debt? To something only known to someone within the family's financial affairs? No clear answer has emerged, but the amount is another linguistic numerical marker that points toward someone with specific knowledge of the family's situation. Regional patterns and education reconstruction. When we stand back and examine all the linguistic evidence together, a profile begins to emerge. We see a writer who is trying to sound more educated than they naturally are, formal in structure, but containing misspellings that reveal actual literacy level. A writer embedded in Southern culture and language, using Southern as a natural modifier, familiar with Southern identity. A writer with access to specific films, specifically Dirty Harry and possibly Ransom, films that provided phrases used in the note. A writer with access to phrases used by people in the family's intimate circle. Fat cat. Grow a brain. Phrases that would not be randomly available to a stranger. A writer capable of composing lengthy, complex sentences while also maintaining civility and courtesy, even in threatening language. A writer with knowledge of the family's finances. The specific amount of $118,000. The reference to business. A writer with access to paper and pen in the Ramsey home. Materials used to write the note. None of this is conclusive. But together, these patterns point toward someone with intimate knowledge of the family. Someone educated, but perhaps not entirely confident. Someone who had seen certain films and read certain materials. Someone who naturally spoke in Southern registers. Someone who knew the family's financial situation. The contradiction of attribution. Here is where the linguistic analysis becomes psychologically significant. Because all the language patterns, all the markers, all the fingerprints of identity point toward someone with intimate knowledge of the family. Yet the note purports to be written by a small foreign faction, an external group, intruders, people with no knowledge of the family's affairs. This is the profound contradiction. The language of the note is the language of someone inside the family, but the content of the note is written as if from people outside. A person trying to stage a kidnapping, trying to make it appear as if an intruder had taken the child, might write a note that pretends to be from outsiders. They might use language borrowed from movies. They might try to disguise their identity through chosen phrases and attempted formality. But even under pressure, even while trying to disguise identity, the writer's authentic patterns would bleed through. Their regional accent would appear. Their actual education level would show. Their knowledge of family finances would reveal itself. Their familiarity with specific films would emerge. This is what we see in the ransom note. A document written by someone attempting to sound external while being fundamentally internal. A document that failed to truly disguise identity because the linguistic fingerprints remained visible. The psychological weight of language. What is most revealing about linguistic analysis is that it exposes the psychological state of the writer. Someone writing under stress, someone writing while in denial about what they have done, someone writing while trying to construct an alternative reality. That person's language will fracture. It will contain contradictions. It will reveal the conflict between what they are trying to appear to be and what they actually are. The ransom note contains this fracture. It is formal and crude. It is polite and violent. It is trying to sound external while being fundamentally internal. It reveals someone who is trying to maintain a narrative while the truth is breaking through in the language itself. The longer the document, the more this fracture shows. And at 3 pages, the ransom note is exceptionally long. It had to be composed, revised, maintained. The writer could not simply dash off a few threatening words and leave. They had to sustain the fiction across multiple pages, multiple paragraphs, multiple attempts at constructing a believable false narrative. The linguistic evidence suggests they failed. The evidence suggests that anyone who knew the family, anyone who was familiar with the household, anyone who read the note carefully, would recognize patterns that pointed toward someone inside rather than outside. What remains uncertain? Linguistic analysis cannot definitively prove who wrote the note, but it can narrow the field. It can identify which patterns are consistent with which profiles. It can eliminate some possibilities and make others more plausible. What we know from linguistic analysis is that the note was likely written by someone who was educated or trying to appear educated, had Southern connections or spoke naturally in Southern registers, had been exposed to certain films and incorporated their language, had intimate knowledge of family phrases and family finances, was trying to disguise identity but could not fully suppress authentic linguistic patterns, faced time pressure or psychological stress while writing, as evidenced by the length and the contradictions within it. This profile points not toward a stranger intruding into the home, but toward someone known to the family, someone with access, someone with motivation, someone whose language, examined carefully, cannot hide who they actually are, because language, in the end, is the most authentic expression of identity.
And so if this person is intelligent enough, then they kind of know this. Why are they writing a 3-page ransom note? Why would they take additional time to sit in the house, compose a sentence or compose sentences, try to start a ransom note, and then say, that ain't it, and then revise the note, not just Mr. and Miss, you know what? We'll just do John. I don't even want to deal with Patsy. We'll just do John. Dear John. Just take Patsy out of it. They create this narrative. You got to come up with a narrative on the spot. Why would they do that if they know that, look, I'm going to be in and out. This is going to work. Because that's a little bit of an extra risk. That's my point. That's a little bit of an extra risk. We talked about this before. Lingering in the house too long. Why this? When we think about the psychology of the criminal, why are they staying in the house that long? And now we're looking at the risk profile. Why are they taking the extra risks to be exposed? That extra time to be exposed? That would be additional evidence. You make a mistake. They already slipped up and left some DNA inside the Bloomies. And they're really good because they left some DNA inside the Bloomies. And that's like the only DNA that they left. I think they supposedly left like one fingerprint on the top right corner of the Long Johns. But other than those two places, that's it. And they had some trouble sort of, I think it was Amy JonBenet and somebody else. They had some trouble sort of recreating the fingerprint a little bit in 2008 with Bodhi Technology, which speaks to the mastermind sort of planned crime scene manipulation, or the tactician who has come into the Ramsey home and just floated in and floated out. It's like the guy essentially flew in there and floated on thin air, and just didn't touch anything. You know what I mean? A smart criminal wouldn't take time. If he's essentially a ghost in the wind, he's not going to take time to sit down and grab a notepad and a pen and try to just spend some time really getting into the thought process and just thinking about this and composing his thoughts while you have this sort of child, in your hands, and you have the two parents upstairs and they can wake at any moment. And of course they say, oh, well, he wrote it before, right? Because he already knew what he was going to do. So he composes it while you're out, but I don't need that. Why would I waste my time? I'm already going to be in and out. I'm in full black, right? Maybe they came in some other clothes, and we have to think about this. How did they get in unsuspected? Because you can't wear a ski mask and gloves and all black to sneak into the house and cross the street. Who's going to believe that? And you got to park somewhere where nobody can see you, maybe in the back alley. You don't know if somebody's looking out of the windows in the whatever. So you got to pull up in something that's going to be legitimate. You can't park the van too far for when you escape. But you probably won't be wearing the all black robbery clothes. You probably won't be wearing that when you go in. Right? You'll probably be wearing something that, makes sense. Somebody that looks nice, looks like he belongs in this neighborhood, looks like there's nothing wrong. And so you just sneak up and then, with the bag, and then you'll change. Oh, look at that guy down there. He's a plumber coming in to do some plumbing work on John and Patsy's house. What a nice guy working on Christmas, right? Type stuff. Oh, I hope his family had a chance to see him on Christmas. So he goes in with different clothes and changes his clothes when he gets in there, leaves the duffel bag somewhere, and he's able to extract that and take that with him on his way out. A criminal is not going to waste their time doing all that, right? If you think about, and we've mentioned this before, if you think about a bank heist, think about somebody who's planning a robbery. How much time do you think that person is going, or persons is going to spend at the bank? It's going to be minutes. They get in, they get the money, they get out. They're not going to sit there in the bank making tea and pineapple with milk. They're not going to sit there and write an ode to the parents or the bankers, the managers of the bank. Dear Mr. Banker, I am coming to run on the bank. And Mr. Banker, I must say to you that I respect you as a person. I know you have a beautiful family. I have nothing wrong with you. It's only the conglomerate of banks that you work for. Which brings me to another point before I move forward. If this person said he respected John, how did JonBenet end up dead? If you respect John, how did JonBenet end up dead? You didn't have any problem with John. That means I don't have any problem with your kids. I don't have any problem with your wife. So in essence, the crime shouldn't even happened. It shouldn't even have happened at the house. The crime shouldn't have even taken place at Lockheed Martin. The crime should have taken place in some sort of government building that the person had some sort of issue with. Also too, I respect you as a person and I respect your business, but not the country that it serves. There's so many other veterans, right? So many other veterans that exist in the United States at this time who are entrepreneurs, who are on a grand scale, probably the same as John, probably doing their thing, probably not newsworthy, but they're doing a pretty good job being an entrepreneur that you probably could have extracted money from. But you chose this one lone person. We still don't know why you chose John. We have no clue. It's very vague why John was chose. I don't like your. All we know is they don't like the country. Well, if you respect John, how would you not respect his daughter enough to protect her and keep her alive? That's what I'm struggling with. Then that means that the person didn't respect you. And yet we have another contradiction between the ransom note. So we can't, that's what I'm saying. We can't even trust the ransom note. We can't trust this ransom note because it's all over the place. All roads lead back to the middle of the fork of the road. We respect your business, and then goes out and does something disrespectful to John. If you respect John, how did JonBenet end up in the position that she was in? Oh, it was a fantasy of the guy. If that was the case, how did JonBenet end up in the position that she was in if you have respect for John? JonBenet would have never been in that position if you had respect for John. Come on. They're not going to write a 3-page manifesto. Getting back to my point. They're not going to write a 3-page manifesto explaining their motivations. They move, they're efficient, they minimize the time that they're in the bank. They minimize the time that they're in this compromised space. And yet this intruder who is supposedly so smart, so careful, leaves no evidence, goes through that process perfectly, but takes time to write a ransom note. Takes time to compose sentences. Takes time to come up with a random narrative. Had to sit there and come up with a random narrative and chose to write 3 pages of it. Had to come off the top of his brain and say, you know what? Let's do 3 pages of this. I feel like I'm back in high school. You know what? Let's just start writing to be writing. Let's just start writing because we have hands and we know how to write. Let's just do that. Composing sentences, constructing a narrative for what? What does the ransom note accomplish? What does the ransom note accomplish that could not be accomplished by simply leaving the child's body and disappearing? Why do you need that note? You think, as careful as you were, you didn't leave anything, as careful as you were, do you think somehow they're going to find you? No, apparently not. They haven't found you yet. And all we have is the last clinging hope is that the only thing we have in 20 or 30 years is the unknown male DNA. That's it. That's all they've extracted. All this intruder did it in 30 years. All you have is an unknown profile that hasn't matched anything yet. Somebody said it's supposed to come back in March of 2026. Hopefully. I'd like to see it. Let's do it. Enough of this talking. Let's get to it. Let's get to testing. And all that time, this guy is so smart. Two people are so smart that all they've left is just a sliver of some unknown some DNA, some touch DNA at that, because you didn't get real DNA. You didn't get solid DNA. You got touch DNA, right? Because we have a note that creates chaos. Sure. Oh, well, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to create chaos. That's why they wrote it, because they didn't want you to trace it back to them. Fine. But the note also creates time. It creates a delay. It creates a moment where someone is reading words instead of searching. And that's fair too. But why would an intruder need that delay if they've already escaped? Why do you need a diversion tactic if you're already gone? Are you concerned with them catching up to you? It seems so. You've created a diversion tactic through the note here, right? You've locked JonBenet in the wine cellar. Diversion tactic number 2. You've wrote the note. You've put her in the wine cellar, right? And you've turned around and you've placed the chairs and boxes in front of the door that you've escaped through. Diversion tactic number 3. So clearly, diverting attention away from you is important to you. But why? You're so careful and so clever. You're already out of the house. Unless the intruder didn't actually believe they escaped. Unless the intruder believed they would be caught. Unless the intruder needed to create a false narrative because they knew they would be implicated. They knew it. A true intruder, someone from outside the family, I don't think would need a false narrative. They're unknown, like the DNA. They're already invisible. John and Patsy clearly don't know them, or know them but can't think about it. So they're essentially invisible. Why would you construct a story when you don't have to? Somebody else might need to construct a story. Somebody else might need to divert attention away because of implications, but not an intruder, because I'm trying to stay under the radar. I'm not trying to draw any attention to me. You had John Mark Carr and stuff like that sort of drawing attention to themselves in the process, hey, it's me, blah, 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 so on and so forth. I did it. I need to meet Patsy before she dies. All this nonsense. But this intruder wouldn't need to do that. And, you know, the contradictions in the note become significant to me because the note tells us someone knows John's finances, $118,000, specific to his bonus or somewhat specific. But the note also tells us that someone doesn't know John. When they say, use your good Southern common sense. And that phrase kind of only makes sense if you're talking to somebody from the South and not talking to John, who's from Michigan. How do you know John's finances, but you don't know that he's not a Southerner? How exactly do you know the specific amount of his bonus, but claim to be sort of this unknown foreign faction? You can't do both. Either you know John or you don't. Either you respect John or you don't. Either you research his finances and you know it so that you can plan out a crime like this, or you don't. You haven't. But somehow we have a ransom note that is claiming both simultaneously. It says, I know everything about your financial situation through the, I can get down to the specificity of the amount. But then I also write, I don't really know you through the Southern reference. And so the contradiction, I think, is the mark of somebody trying to maintain two narratives at once. All roads lead back to nothing. Someone trying to appear external while being fundamentally internal. I want to make it seem like I'm on the outside, but actually I am on the inside. And that's what somebody on the inside would do. They would try to write from an external perspective, but sometimes the things done internally and would only be known to people internally would give them away. Because we're thinking about somebody who knows the family, who has access to the family's information, who understands the family circumstances, but is trying to create the appearance of an outside threat. And sort of trying to maintain that contradiction across 3 pages when you just have to come up with something, when you have to just write something, and all that time you started over and that's what you came up with. You're trying to maintain this mental separation, composing these sentences, trying to create this narrative while trying to also make it coherent enough that it seems like a ransom demand that takes a lot of energy. It's going to take a lot of energy. It's going to take a lot of time because you have to sit there and come up with a narrative when you write this note. And especially since you're writing this note from a position of, I don't even know how much, because they had to, if that's the case, they had to at least go in there and explore a little bit. They had to spend some time exploring the house because think about everything that they had to do once they got into the house. They had to make the garrote. They had to get familiar with the house. They had to find how much John made, and so they had to wander upstairs into his office. They probably had to scope out Burke's room. They had to scope out JonBenet's room. And that's not something that you can just fly through. You need a little time to scope out everything. You got to scope out exits that you can take. You have to understand the layout of the house a little bit more. And it's something the house is weird. So you're going to have to kind of walk through the house a couple of times to kind of try to figure it out, understand where you're going, find out how not to get lost, because the last thing you want to do is get caught on the front steps and John and Patsy are coming through that through the front door, or the last thing you want to do is get caught on the back spiral staircase, and then all of a sudden John and Patsy are coming up the spiral staircase, and so you run into Burke's room real quick, and then Patsy's coming into Burke's room or coming down that way for whatever reason. You got to know where to run to get away. I can't run down these steps because that's going to lead me right. I can't run down the front steps because that's going to lead me right to the front room, the living room, where Burke and John are setting up this toy. And I'm going to come downstairs dressed in all black, and they're going to be like, "And who are you?" So I got to know this house enough to maneuver and be able to not get caught. I got to know this house enough to know I need to go upstairs, grab JonBenet, bring her back down. I got to know enough about this house to know that if I'm hungry, I can grab something. Here's the refrigerator. Here's the freezer. Because the way that stuff looked in the kitchen wasn't apparently obvious. Right? The freezer looked a little different. So you might not think it's a freezer. It's like, okay, I need to figure out where everything is, so I don't just run and grab something and just be lost. I don't want to run through this door, open up the door, and I'm in the garage and I don't know how to get out if things get bad. So he needs time to sort of walk through the house and understand that. And then to have to take time to sit down and come up with some random narrative and write 3 pages on it. That's weird. And what's also funny is, for some strange and odd reason, we don't have any more pages of the ransom note being attempted. All we have is another page where they attempted to address it to John and Patsy. They didn't write anything. And then for some strange and odd reason, they decided to now to just go to another page and address it to John. They didn't even start the letter. So we don't know what prompted them to address it to John out of nowhere. I don't understand that. Like, if you know that your qualms are with John for whatever business he's doing, Patsy doesn't even work. Patsy has nothing to do with this. So you wouldn't even think of Patsy on the first go round. You would immediately think of John. If you actually had something to say to Patsy, you would have written some down. Because you would have already had something to say. Otherwise, I'm not just... If I'm trying to get a job and I need to write a cover letter, I'm not going to write "Dear Selection Committee" and "Dear Accounting." I'm not going to write that. If I write a letter that it's going to be specifically, and I need to write a letter to both, I'm going to write something to the hiring committee, and I'm going to write a specific number, a letter to accounting. 2 different conversations, because they're not the same committee. I'm going to have to prove to the hiring selection committee that I have what it takes, just in a broad sense, in terms of my skills. So I'm going to keep it higher level, keep it kind of shallow, but just enough to know that, so I'm dangerous. But if I go straight to accounting, I'm going to say, hey, look, I've got this skill. I've worked with this. So that I actually know what I'm talking about. You guys do your books at month end, so on and so forth. I've done month end closings and stuff like that, so blah, blah, blah. I've done reconciliations. I've done all of those things. I know how to do that. I've had to balance the balance. I've had to do with the balance. I've had to balance the balance sheet. I know how the funds flow into the cash flow statement, from the income statement, and from the balance sheet. I know all of that, and I know how to forecast and look at pro forma state. I know how to do all of those things. Right? Those are 2 different letters, right? You're talking about 2 different things. You're being technical in a way in the accounting letter that you would not be in the overall hiring committee letter. And that's what I'm saying. Why start off a letter to somebody, not write anything, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Just waste time. That means if you made a pivot without writing anything, that means that you sat there and you tried to ideate. That means that you sat there and you were trying to think of something. And after you realize, hey, man, I can't come up with anything, let's just write it to John. That means that you came up with a scenario in your head immediately for John and said, you know what, I don't have anything to write to Patsy. I immediately have a scenario for John. I have a full 3-page just in this moment right now. I just got to download all for John. All of it's for John. That don't make no sense. That's the problems I have. Anyways, please enjoy the video.